You're barefoot. Did you forget your shoes?
No.
No.
I broke my toe yesterday.
You're kidding me.
And I tried to find a comfortable shoe, but I just decided.
Mom bag, which is not something I can share with everyone because there's too much of everybody else's stuff in it. Mom, can you hold my phone? Mom, can you take this? Something there, I need this. I usually have snacks.
At the height of success, most people hold on tighter. They protect their position. They reinforce the image. They do whatever it takes to stay visible. Walking away is not the instinct. Yet sometimes distance is not retreat, it's survival. This story doesn't begin with failure, scandal, or irrelevance. It begins with exhaustion, with the slow realization that visibility can become a cage, and that constant presence comes at a cost that applause can't offset. Hollywood rewards availability. It expects repetition. It thrives on momentum. But momentum, sustained too long, erodes space for reflection. Roles blur. Identity flattens. The line between who you are and what you represent grows dangerously thin. For years, the spotlight followed every move. Choices scrutinized, silence interpreted, evolution resisted. Success became predictable, but fulfillment did not. The industry that once offered freedom began to feel transactional, even limiting. The decision that followed confused many. Opportunities were still there. Influence remained intact. The exit wasn't forced, it was chosen. For Angelina Jolie, stepping away from Hollywood wasn't about disappearing. It was about reclaiming authorship over a life that had been lived too long under observation. And the reasons behind that choice run deeper than most people realize. At the height of her career, there was no external pressure to leave. The roles were still coming. The recognition was intact. The influence was undeniable. By every traditional metric, this was the moment to consolidate power, not step away from it, which is exactly why the decision confused so many people. From the outside, Hollywood framed it as a personal pivot, a star choosing family, a shift toward directing, a humanitarian phase that would eventually circle back to acting. These explanations were convenient, digestible, and reassuring. They were also incomplete, because what was happening wasn't a change of interest. It was a loss of alignment. For years, the industry had rewarded a specific version of her, one that fit neatly into archetypes, headlines, and narratives that could be endlessly recycled. Strength was stylized, vulnerability was aestheticized, complexity was tolerated only when it could be controlled. That system works well until it doesn't. As time passed, the gap between what the industry wanted and what she was willing to offer widened. The roles began to feel repetitive in a deeper sense. Not in genre or character, but in function. They asked for presence without purpose. Visibility without authorship, performance without consequence, and that kind of work extracts a cost that isn't immediately visible. It erodes agency. Hollywood is efficient at turning people into symbols. Once that happens, every decision is interpreted through an existing frame. Growth becomes deviation. Silence becomes speculation. Refusal becomes controversy. Operating within that framework requires constant negotiation. What can be said? What must be withheld? Which parts of oneself are allowed to evolve, and which must remain fixed for continuity? Over time, that negotiation becomes exhausting. The roles that once felt expansive began to feel restrictive, not because they lacked prestige, but because they came pre-interpreted. The audience arrived already knowing who they thought she was. The performance no longer had room to surprise. That's a subtle kind of stagnation. It doesn't show up as burnout or scandal. It shows up as disconnection, as the sense that participation no longer produces meaning proportional to the energy it consumes. This is where many careers quietly fracture. Some push through it, trading fulfillment for momentum. Others disappear abruptly. And a few make a slower, more deliberate choice to redirect their energy toward work that doesn't require translation through an industry filter. That redirection wasn't impulsive. It unfolded over years, alongside a growing awareness that influence could exist outside traditional celebrity structures. That visibility wasn't the same as impact, and that the stories she wanted to tell didn't fit comfortably within the system that had elevated her. This realization coincided with deeper exposure to global contexts far removed from Hollywood's concerns. In those environments, narrative functioned differently. It wasn't about image, it was about consequence. Not about performance, but about outcome. That contrast sharpened the disillusionment. Returning to Hollywood after that kind of exposure can feel surreal. The stakes shrink. The urgency feels artificial. The conversations begin to sound circular. And the work, no matter how polished, can feel disconnected from reality. This doesn't mean acting lost its value. It means the ecosystem surrounding it no longer made sense. The industry still wanted access to the image, the name, the association. But it offered less space for authorship, less tolerance for discomfort, less willingness to engage with stories that didn't resolve neatly or reinforce familiar dynamics. At a certain point, participation becomes complicity, and walking away becomes an ethical decision rather than a career one. This is where the narrative often gets oversimplified. It's tempting to frame the choice as personal preference or lifestyle adjustment, but those explanations avoid the harder truth: that Hollywood struggles to accommodate people who outgrow the roles it assigns them, especially when that growth challenges the industry's own priorities. Stepping back wasn't about rejecting fame. Fame was already secured. It was about rejecting a structure that required constant performance without allowing genuine evolution. And evolution was non-negotiable. The projects that followed reflected that shift. They were smaller, riskier, less polished in the conventional sense, but they offered something Hollywood increasingly resisted: control over perspective, control over what stories meant, control over who they centered, control over what questions they asked without rushing toward answers. That control came with trade-offs: reduced visibility, less media amplification, fewer opportunities that came pre-approved by the system. But it also came with freedom. Freedom to operate without constant translation, without flattening complexity for mass consumption. This wasn't disappearance, it was withdrawal from a structure that no longer fit. Hollywood often interprets withdrawal as decline, but decline assumes the same metric still matters. In this case, the metric had changed. Success was no longer measured by box office or presence. It was measured by alignment, by whether the work contributed to something tangible, by whether participation felt honest rather than habitual. That shift is difficult to explain publicly because it resists sound bites. It doesn't fit into redemption arcs or comeback narratives. It's not dramatic enough to be scandalous and not neat enough to be inspirational. So it gets simplified. But simplification misses the point. This wasn't a star fading away. It was a person choosing not to remain inside a system that no longer reflected her values, despite the comfort, prestige, and protection it still offered. As the distance from Hollywood widened, the reasons behind it became harder to ignore. What once felt like creative friction began to look more like a structural problem, one that couldn't be solved by choosing better roles or taking longer breaks between projects. At the center of that problem was power. Hollywood presents itself as a meritocracy, but longevity reveals a more complicated truth. Influence is unevenly distributed, narratives are tightly managed, and even the most successful figures operate within constraints that are rarely acknowledged publicly. Visibility comes with access, but also with expectations that quietly dictate behavior. For a long time, those expectations were manageable. They aligned closely enough with the work being offered, but alignment erodes when the system values predictability more than growth. The industry prefers familiarity. It rewards consistency of image over evolution of perspective. When someone becomes globally recognizable, deviation is no longer seen as exploration. It's framed as risk. That framing doesn't disappear with success. It intensifies. Creative autonomy begins to narrow. Scripts arrive pre-shaped by assumption. Characters are written with an existing persona in mind. The work stops being a dialogue and becomes a confirmation. At that stage, participation no longer feels like creation. It feels like maintenance. Maintenance of brand, maintenance of expectation, maintenance of a version that no longer reflects internal reality. This is where the tension became unsustainable. The stories that mattered most, stories about displacement, consequence, resilience, and power imbalance, did not fit easily into Hollywood's commercial logic. They were slower, more uncomfortable, less oriented toward resolution, and crucially, they resisted simplification. Those stories require trust. Trust that audiences will sit with ambiguity. Trust that discomfort can coexist with engagement. Trust that meaning doesn't need to be packaged for immediate reward. Hollywood, increasingly driven by scale and speed, struggled to offer that trust. At the same time, media framing intensified the pressure. Every decision was filtered through speculation. Silence was read as strategy. Selectivity was read as decline. And any deviation from expected visibility triggered narratives that had little to do with the work itself. That constant interpretation erodes authenticity. When every move is narrativized externally, the ability to act from internal clarity diminishes. Choices become reactive rather than intentional. The work begins to answer questions it never asked. Stepping back interrupted that cycle. Distance reduced noise. It created space where decisions could be made without immediate translation. Projects could be evaluated on purpose rather than perception. And most importantly, influence could be exercised without needing validation from the same system that constrained it. This is where the shift became irreversible. Operating outside Hollywood's center doesn't mean disengaging from storytelling. It means redefining how stories function. Instead of being vehicles for image, they become instruments for attention, directing focus toward issues that rarely receive sustained visibility. That redirection changed the stakes of participation. The work no longer needed to succeed by Hollywood's metrics. It needed to matter by different ones tied to impact, consequence, and long-term relevance rather than immediate reception. That recalibration made returning to the old structure increasingly difficult. Hollywood's power dynamics are subtle but persistent. Control often resides not in overt censorship, but in incentive. The projects that receive backing are those that fit within established patterns. Those that challenge the pattern must justify themselves repeatedly. Over time, that justification becomes a tax on energy, a tax on clarity, a tax on purpose. Walking away removed that tax. It allowed for engagement on terms that didn't require compromise at the level of values. That freedom came at the cost of mainstream amplification. But amplification was no longer the objective. This is where the narrative often gets distorted. The choice is framed as sacrifice, of fame, of opportunity, of relevance. But sacrifice implies loss of something still desired. In this case, the desire had shifted. What was gained was coherence. Coherence between action and belief, between visibility and intention, between storytelling and lived experience. That coherence is difficult to maintain within systems optimized for output rather than alignment. Remaining would have required continued negotiation with a structure that resisted change. And negotiation, when it becomes constant, ceases to be collaboration. It becomes erosion. The decision to step back wasn't dramatic because it didn't need to be. There was no single breaking point, no public rejection, just a gradual recognition that the system could not support the kind of work and the kind of life that had become essential. Hollywood often struggles with this kind of departure because it lacks spectacle. There's no scandal to explain it, no failure to justify it, no comeback narrative to anticipate. It's simply a refusal to continue playing a role that no longer fits. That refusal challenges the industry more than open criticism ever could, because it suggests that success alone is not sufficient to retain talent, that meaning, agency, and alignment matter more than access. And when those elements are absent, even the most privileged position can feel hollow. This isn't a story about abandoning art. It's a story about reclaiming authorship. Authorship over time, authorship over attention, authorship over one's own narrative. The work that followed reflected that shift. It asked different questions, it centered different voices, it operated at a different pace, and it resisted the pressure to perform relevance according to outdated metrics. That resistance is often misread as withdrawal, but withdrawal implies disengagement. This was reorientation. With time, the decision stopped looking like absence and started looking like authorship. What many initially framed as withdrawal slowly revealed itself as a boundary, one drawn deliberately, not defensively. Hollywood struggled to read that boundary. The industry is fluent in two narratives: ascent and collapse, rising stars and fallen icons, comebacks and cancellations. What it struggles to process is conscious refusal, especially when refusal comes without bitterness, spectacle, or explanation. This choice offered none of that. There was no denunciation of the industry, no manifesto, no dramatic break, just a steady reorientation toward work that operated outside Hollywood's feedback loop. And that quietness made the decision harder to categorize and easier to misinterpret. So the industry filled the silence. Some called it retreat. Others called it inconsistency. A few framed it as relevance slipping away. But those interpretations assumed that Hollywood remained the primary reference point, and that assumption was already outdated. The truth is that staying would have required a continued performance of alignment that no longer existed. Not alignment with craft, but with a system that prioritizes visibility over substance and efficiency over depth. The further that gap widened, the more participation began to feel symbolic rather than sincere. Symbolic participation is draining. It asks for presence without contribution. It rewards repetition over evolution. And it subtly discourages questioning the structures that benefit from stability more than truth. Walking away disrupted that cycle. It demonstrated that influence does not require constant exposure. That cultural weight can be exercised laterally rather than vertically. And that relevance does not depend on proximity to power centers when purpose is clearly defined. For Angelina Jolie, this shift recalibrated legacy in a way Hollywood rarely anticipates. Instead of being frozen in a particular era or persona, the work became contextual, connected to global realities rather than industry cycles. That connection changed how success was measured. The question was no longer how many people saw it, but who it served. Not how loud was the reaction, but how durable was the impact. These metrics don't trend easily. They don't generate immediate validation, but they accumulate over time. Hollywood often mistakes accumulation for absence because accumulation doesn't announce itself. What followed was not invisibility, but selectivity. Fewer projects, chosen deliberately. Stories that resisted simplification. Work that prioritized consequence over applause. And involvement that extended beyond performance into responsibility. This kind of engagement challenges the industry because it exposes its limitations. Hollywood excels at manufacturing identity, but it struggles to accommodate people who outgrow the identities it assigns, especially when that growth demands structural change rather than personal reinvention. The system is built to circulate talent, not transform itself. That's why departures like this feel unsettling. They suggest that success within the system may still fail to satisfy deeper measures of meaning. And that suggestion threatens the industry's central promise, that visibility and fulfillment ultimately align. They don't always. The legacy of this decision is not defined by what was left behind, but by what was preserved. Integrity, coherence, the ability to choose work without translating it for market logic, the freedom to engage with complexity without being asked to soften it. These are rare privileges, but they come with costs Hollywood rarely acknowledges. Reduced amplification, reduced financial incentive, reduced cultural immediacy. But those losses were offset by something more enduring: autonomy. Autonomy over time, autonomy over narrative, autonomy over values. That autonomy reshaped how the work was received. It no longer needed consensus. It didn't aim for ubiquity. It existed in specific contexts, serving specific purposes, and that specificity made it resistant to trend cycles. Hollywood often equates relevance with saturation, but saturation fades quickly. Purpose doesn't. The industry still struggles to reconcile this choice because it resists resolution. There is no comeback to anticipate, no return to negotiate. The path taken doesn't loop back toward the center. It moves outward, and outward movement challenges systems built on centralization. This is why the decision continues to be reframed, reinterpreted, and occasionally misunderstood. Because it doesn't fit the narratives Hollywood uses to make sense of itself. It doesn't affirm the idea that the industry is the final destination rather than one possible chapter. The story ultimately reveals something uncomfortable, that walking away can be an act of strength rather than retreat, that refusing to participate in misalignment is not a failure of ambition, but a refinement of it, and that some forms of success cannot be sustained within systems that resist ethical and creative evolution. Hollywood often asks what it lost when someone steps back. A better question is what it failed to provide. The legacy here is not about absence from screens. It's about presence in spaces where attention carries consequence, where storytelling intersects with lived reality, and where identity is not flattened for consumption. This decision didn't diminish a career, it clarified it. And in doing so, it exposed the limits of an industry that remains powerful, but not always sufficient for those who seek meaning beyond visibility. With enough distance, the decision no longer reads as withdrawal. It reads as calibration. Hollywood is built on momentum. It rewards those who remain visible, available, and adaptable to its rhythms. The longer someone stays, the more the system assumes alignment between personal values and institutional priorities. When that alignment breaks, the industry rarely notices at first. It keeps offering opportunities that look generous on paper, but feel hollow in practice. That hollow feeling is difficult to explain publicly. It doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't lend itself to scandal or headlines. It's simply the realization that participation no longer produces meaning proportional to the cost. And once that realization takes hold, continuing becomes an act of performance rather than purpose. This is where the departure becomes instructive. Walking away wasn't about rejecting art or audience. It was about refusing to confuse access with agency. Hollywood offers access in abundance, platforms, capital, amplification, but agency is conditional. It exists only as long as it aligns with what the system can absorb without friction. When friction becomes constant, autonomy erodes. The choice to step back revealed a truth the industry prefers to keep abstract, that success does not guarantee fulfillment and visibility does not equal influence. Influence, in its most durable form, comes from alignment between belief, action, and consequence. Hollywood struggles with alignment because it prioritizes output over coherence. The system is optimized for production, not reflection. It moves quickly, incentivizes repetition, and resists pauses that might invite reassessment. People who thrive within it often learn to compartmentalize, values in one place, work in another. For some, that compartmentalization is manageable. For others, it becomes untenable. The decision to leave the center disrupted that logic. It suggested that the cost of staying can exceed the benefits, even at the highest levels of success. That insight is uncomfortable for an industry that frames departure as loss rather than choice. It prefers narratives of decline because they reaffirm the system's centrality. But this wasn't decline. It was a redefinition of success itself. Success became less about accumulation and more about coherence, less about recognition and more about responsibility, less about staying visible and more about staying honest. Those metrics don't translate easily into box office numbers or awards. They don't generate weekly updates or trending cycles, but they accumulate quietly, shaping legacy over time rather than moment to moment. Hollywood often misreads that quietness as irrelevance, but irrelevance fades. Coherence endures. The work that followed reflected this shift. It resisted spectacle. It centered voices and stories that rarely benefit from mainstream amplification. It operated at a pace that allowed context to matter, and it accepted reduced visibility as the cost of maintaining integrity. That cost is real. Stepping outside the system means relinquishing certain protections. Media narratives become harder to manage. Support structures thin out. Influence becomes less centralized and more dispersed. But dispersion is not weakness, it's resilience. Resilient influence doesn't depend on constant attention. It survives shifts in culture because it's anchored to values rather than trends. This is why the departure continues to be misunderstood. Hollywood tends to measure commitment by proximity. The further someone moves from the center, the easier it is to assume disengagement. But engagement can take many forms, and some of the most consequential ones occur away from cameras and premieres. The industry also struggles with examples that challenge its incentives. A high-profile figure choosing alignment over amplification raises questions the system would rather avoid. Questions about sustainability, about ethics, about what happens when success stops being the ultimate motivator. Those questions don't have comfortable answers, and so the narrative often defaults to simplification, a pause, a phase, a detour. Anything that preserves the assumption that the center remains the destination. But the story here suggests something else. It suggests that for some people, the center is no longer sufficient, that growth can outpace structures, and that leaving is sometimes the only way to preserve the integrity of the work and the person doing it. This isn't a prescription for everyone. It's a reminder that creative systems, no matter how powerful, have limits, and that recognizing those limits requires clarity, not courage. Courage is often framed as staying and enduring. Clarity is knowing when endurance becomes erosion. Hollywood celebrates endurance. But endurance without alignment leads to emptiness. The legacy of this choice isn't defined by absence from screens. It's defined by the refusal to let identity be flattened into utility, by the insistence that work should point outward to consequence, context, and responsibility, rather than inward to image. That insistence reshaped what legacy could look like. Not a highlight reel of performances, but a body of work connected by intention. Not a constant presence, but a deliberate one. Not a career optimized for visibility, but a life structured around coherence. Hollywood still struggles to interpret that kind of success because it doesn't scale. It can't be mass-produced, it doesn't offer a template. And that's precisely why it matters. Because templates reproduce systems. Choices like this expose their limits. The story ultimately isn't about walking away from Hollywood. It's about walking toward alignment. And alignment, once prioritized, changes everything. How work is chosen, how influence is exercised, and how legacy is defined. Not by how long someone stayed visible, but by how intentionally they chose when to step back. If this story reshaped how you think about success, visibility, and why some people choose alignment over applause, stay with the channel. Here we go beyond celebrity headlines to explore why icons make the decisions they do, what those decisions reveal about power and identity, and how walking away can sometimes be the most honest form of control. Subscribe for more deep documentary-style breakdowns of celebrities' careers and the unseen turning points that redefine legacy. And if there's another public figure whose disappearance deserves this level of psychological analysis, share it in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful statement is knowing when not to stay.